Hey everyone, welcome to The New Populist. I'm Dave Brown. If you're new to this channel, please like and subscribe. Well, our President Joe Biden nominated a woman named Saleh Omarova to lead an office called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and this is a office within the Treasury Department. And normally, none of us would have ever heard of this, but because of who this nominee is, it has gained some attention in the national media. She was born in the former Soviet Union in Kazakhstan. She graduated from Moscow State University in 1989 and went there under a Lenin Personal Academic Scholarship where she majored in philosophy. And ignoring the name, the Lenin Personal Academic Scholarship for a second, if you major in philosophy in the Soviet Union, you are well trained in Marxism, dialectical materialism, everything under that communist umbrella. And this is, it's 1989. She moves to the United States in 1991, where she gets her PhD and later her Juris Doctorate, and worked within the Treasury under the Bush administration. And you have to wonder why in the United States we allow people who are born, raised, and educated in countries that are extremely antagonistic toward the United States. We allow them to move here, get further educated, become citizens, and then work within our government. Now, before you say, okay, you're red baiting, you're being xenophobic, well, 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants. My father was an immigrant. I'm not against that, but I do think it's useful to recognize that when this happens in large numbers, not everybody who comes here wants to embrace Americanism. Sometimes they come here bringing some of the philosophy from their old country. But let me give you the reverse scenario to show how kind of ridiculous this can be. Imagine a white guy born in Arkansas. He goes to Hillsdale College, a conservative university. He majors in history. And he goes under a scholarship called let's call it the Benjamin Franklin Scholarship. And he focuses on, the U.S. Constitution, and he graduates, but then he decides, you know what, I want to go to China. And he goes to China, he goes to a university in China, gets his PhD, then becomes a citizen, then works within the Chinese government, and is later nominated by Xi Jinping to lead an office within the Chinese government. Could that scenario ever happen? It's preposterous to even think about that. But yet in the United States, this happens all the time. We have people coming from China, from Russia, and other countries that are highly antagonistic toward the United States. They come here not as children, but as adults to study within our universities. Some of them stay here, become citizens, and then work within the United States government. Now, in most cases, the people are perfectly fine, but as we know with China, for example, we have a lot of Chinese spies within this country who come here to work within universities and end up stealing research materials and sending it back to the motherland. We had Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California. Her driver of 20 years was a Chinese spy. We have Eric Swalwell, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He was sleeping with a Chinese spy. So there is a national security aspect to allowing people to come here from other countries who are very adversarial toward the United States. And it's a realistic thing. But you bring it up and you're accused of being a bigot or a xenophobe. Well, in the case of Saleh Omarova, besides the fact that she was born in the Soviet Union, she has said a lot of things that has been considered kind of radical or pro-Soviet Union. And in one instance, she was, praises the Soviet system of how they pay people within the government system and how we need to have that here in the United States. She advocated for the elimination of private banking and having everything put under the Federal Reserve System. So she's very clearly a statist, and she wants to increase the authority of the federal government. And I went through her Twitter, and she is a big proponent of a thing called the National Investment Authority. And she talks about this repeatedly on her Twitter. And I said, well, if she's such a big proponent of this, we need to find out what the hell this thing is. Because if this became something that was implemented within the United States, well, that's a big problem. So what is the National Investment Authority? Well, she wrote an article about it. And going through this article, there were a lot of things that really stand out as being concerning for us who value liberty and freedom and who don't want the government to keep on absorbing more and more of the private sector. So let me go through this article with you. And first, let's give the groundwork for why she thinks we need this National Investment Authority. And she writes, in the wake of the COVID crisis, we are facing a multifaceted challenge of rebuilding the American economy by addressing climate change, economic and racial inequality, financialization, and privatization of productive assets and other structural problems the crisis made impossible to ignore. And like most people on the left, they bring up climate change and racial inequality. And it's funny because she's talking about an investment. It's something financial, yet even when talking about finances, climate change and inequality and racial stuff somehow are part of that. It seeps into everything, which should tell us on the right that it's just more social engineering and more control. And she goes on to say, leaving this effort in the hands of private actors and markets is not an option. A massive shift toward a sustainable, inclusive, and dynamic 21st century economy requires tremendous commitment of public resources and, just as importantly, public leadership and coordination. It is fundamentally political undertaking, which involves making explicit distributional choices and using governmental powers to turn them into reality. To do this right, we need a well-designed institutional base, a federal entity with democratic accountability, broad legal authority, and in-house capacity to identify long-term economic development goals, translate them into specific investment priorities, and finance and actively implement these priorities in practice. Okay, so we're talking about a massive shift, and this thing cannot be left in the hands of the private sector. And she says, the NIA would be a federal entity created by Congress to fill the institutional gap between the Treasury, our fiscal authority, and the Federal Reserve, our central bank. It will be charged with devising, financing, and executing a long-term national strategy of economic development and reconstruction. The NIA would act directly in financial markets, actively allocating both public and private capital to where it is most needed in our fight against, again, climate change, inequality, and other structural ills. We can call it industrial or developmental policy, a crucial supplement to the fiscal and monetary policies. So we're going to, again, fight climate change and inequality and other structural ills. Now, what she goes on to say here is where we have to pay attention. And you think, well, okay, well, we're going to make things better, right? We're going to invest in all these things that are going to build up our society. But then she says here, importantly, these projects need not all be commercially viable in the conventional market sense. Unlike private fund managers, Nikki Mack, and Nikki Mack is the organization that's directing the funding here, does not have to squeeze cash revenues out of its portfolio assets to repay fund investors. This is because its investments are driven not by short-term profits, but by public policy considerations, and if and when necessary, it can leverage its direct access to the federal government's financial resources. So in this scenario, private investors could invest in Nikki Mack, and Nikki Mack's goal is not to invest in things that are commercially viable. They can focus in the other unconventional things. And that's okay. And why is it okay? Because, well, if these projects don't really pan out and they're not really making any money, well, they have direct access to federal government financial resources. In other words, they have access to our money to subsidize their projects when they are not financially viable. What could possibly go wrong there by incentivizing investing into projects that are not financially viable? And it goes on here. Thus, Nicky Mack could guarantee return of the principal investment to those investing in funds prioritizing commercially unprofitable projects like toll-free roads, adult education centers, or public parks. In addition, the Federal Reserve's continuous liquidity support would play the critical role in increasing the NIA's ability to finance what needs to be built rather than what generates short-term profits. By maintaining a liquid secondary market for NIB bonds and a dedicated borrowing line for Nicky Mack, the Federal Reserve would effectively free the NIA from the debilitating constraints of commercial viability. So by leaning on the Federal Reserve System, when managers are looking at these projects going, okay, is this going to be, is this viable? They can go, well, we don't have to worry about that because the Federal Reserve, again, is going to back it up. So when we do dumb things and invest in projects that are just ridiculous, but we say has some sort of social value, it's okay, again, because it's being subsidized and backed up by the Federal Reserve System. And she goes on here and says, in short, the bigger and more assertive NIA would help to reverse the systemic damage wrought by a decades-long process of privatizing control over the nation's economic resources. In this sense, the NIA is the exact opposite of the traditional public-private partnership model of infrastructure finance. Instead of placing public money under private managers' control, here the public institution controls how private investors' capital is deployed and how their contribution is rewarded. Well, I think it makes a lot of sense that Omarova is from the Soviet Union, where the Soviet Union, they control, well, when they existed, all the resources and had managers direct money and funds into the projects that the Soviet government prioritized. How did that work out for the Soviet Union, this sort of model of having government managers invest things in things that weren't viable? Okay, that's right. The Soviet Union no longer exists. They crashed. That model failed. And here we have a woman from the Soviet Union advocating investments into commercially unviable projects that will be subsidized by the taxpayer. This is how you destroy countries. We have 23 trillion in debt. We've had tons of programs that we've subsidized, and do they ever get better? No, they become more and more inefficient, and they become money pits. If we think back to the 2008 financial crisis, we had a situation there again where the federal government was backing up loans, and because of that, the lenders were being much more whimsical in who they gave the money to, and that tripped this whole disaster. Anytime you give incentives to lend money out in a situation where the government's going to back up that loan, regardless of how smart that loan is, you create a lot of bad behavior. You're essentially subsidizing failure. And this National Investment Authority is just that. We're going to have, in her case, she talks about public managers, a board of directors to manage these funds into projects that will benefit our fight against climate change or racial inequality, that aren't commercially viable, but they're for the social good. And if it all fails, if it all goes to hell in a handbasket and these projects are just burning, smoldering pit of nonsense, it's okay, because we can go to the U.S. taxpayer, to the Federal Reserve System, and we can get loads of cash to throw at the project to make sure the investors in this projects get their money back. Again, you want to have a model to destroy a country, well, here you go. And this person probably, I guarantee you, will be confirmed in this office. Now, this whole thing, the NIA, it's an idea of hers. Obviously, what we have to look out for is this thing being slipped into legislation in the future, a future infrastructure package. The current one, that's $3.5 trillion. That one's probably not going to pass, but us on the right, we need to look out in the future. So if you see a thing in a future infrastructure package that's presented by the left, by the Democrats, look out for a thing called the National Investment Authority. You've been warned. These are the kind of things that they're thinking of. And right now they're just ideas. But as you know, ideas, things come into fruition. And 3 or 4 or 5 years down the line, this thing slips its way into legislation. And all of a sudden we have a National Investment Authority, another boondoggle, another black hole for money, and another loss for people who value freedom and value private markets and capitalism. So we know what to look out for. This lady is a radical, and she should not be in our U.S. government running any office. That's it for now. Again, if you're new to this channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.